The following graph gives information about people at dining table. There is a brown table in the middle, made of wood and surrounded by adults and kids. A couple, grandchildren and grandparents are having the meal. A lot of tableware is on the table, including forks and knives. Also, you can see some drinks, water, orange juice and wine. What's more, some salad is in a glass bowl on the table. To sum up, the graph tells about how people have a meal. The image depicts a comparison between food pyramids in 1970s and 2010s. The left one has 4 layers and the right one has 3 layers. We can see wine bottle on the top of the pyramid in 1970s, and rice in a blue bowl on the top of the pyramid in 2010s. Then meat is in the second layer in both 1970s and 2010s. Fruits are in the bottom layer in 2010s. In conclusion, the picture compares food pyramids in different decades. This picture shows us plastic recycling. The first stage starts with plastic bottles thrown into rubbish bins. Once this is completed, the subsequent step is to collect rubbish with a cart. After that, all the plastic bottles are crushed by shredding machine. Then they are taken away by a conveyor belt to be washed. The following steps are melting, extrusion and pelletizing. The process concludes with the final output of granules. The following graph gives information about a hydrological cycle. At the center of the image, there are runoff, evaporation, lakes and rivers. The image features several prominent elements, including the sun, clouds, mountains, seawater, and so on. One of the main objects in the picture is the sun, high in the upper right corner. In the background, there is a blue sky with a lot of white clouds. What's more, evaporation above the sea, condensation in the air, precipitation and rivers make a complete hydrological cycle. In conclusion, the graph tells about how water goes through a hydrological cycle. The following map gives information about the distribution of harlequin ladybird in England. The red dots indicate positions of the birds in 2004, and the black dots indicate those in 2005. We can see in 2004 the birds mainly lived in the east part of England, near North Sea. We can also see the number of the birds decreased in 2005. And only a very small part of the birds lived inland. In conclusion, the map is very informative. The following line chart gives information about ownerships of cell phone and smartphone in the US. From the line chart we can see in 2005, about 62% of adults owned a cell phone. In 2010, about 35% of adults owned a smartphone, and 80% owned a cell phone. In 2020, about 80% owned a smartphone and 96% owned a cell phone. In conclusion, the gap between the ownerships of smartphone and cell phone is decreasing. The following picture gives information about the number of US households keeping pets. From the bar chart, we can see the value of cats is 42.7 million. The value of dogs is higher, which is 63 million. From the bar chart, we can see the highest value is for turtle, which is 84.9 million. The lowest value is for horses and saltwater fish, which is 1.6 million. In the bar chart there are also other items, including freshwater fish and birds. In conclusion, this bar chart is very informative. The following graph gives information about volunteers who incurred expenses. The items include postage, phone calls, and uniform. According to this graph, in meals, the value of reimbursement is around 16%, and that of phone calls is higher, which is around 19%. You can see from this graph that the highest value of reimbursement is in postage, which is 37. You can also see from this graph that the lowest value of reimbursement is uniform. In conclusion, this bar chart is very informative. The following graph gives information about the apartment floor plan. Usages of different areas are displayed on the plan. In the upper area, there are the bedroom and the living room. In the lower left corner, it is a bathroom with a closet next to it. According to this graph, the kitchen is next to the closet on the right side. What's more, a balcony is connected with the kitchen. To sum up, the graph tells about how the rooms are arranged. The following graph gives information about pounds of chocolate consumed per capita in countries each year. The items include Switzerland, Germany, Ireland, Norway, etc. According to this graph, in Sweden, the value is 11.9, and that of Australia is lower, which is around 10.8. You can see from this graph that the highest value is in Switzerland, which is 19.8. You can also see from this graph that the lowest value is in France. In conclusion, Switzerland consumes more chocolate than any another county does. The following graph gives information about New Zealand house price. The items include New Zealand and OECD. The horizontal axis is year, ranging from 1990 to 2014. According to this graph, in 1990, the value of New Zealand is around 100, and that of OECD is almost the same. According to this graph, the highest value of New Zealand is 250, which is in 2007. According to this graph, the value of New Zealand is higher than OECD. In conclusion, OECD has smaller changes. The following graph gives information about percentages by age and sex. The items include age groups, female and male. According to this graph, in male, the value of 85 plus is around 0.7, and that of 75 to 84 is higher, which is around 3. You can see from this graph that the highest value of female is in 25 to 34, which is 16.5. You can also see from this graph that the value of less than 4 is 7.8. In conclusion, 85 plus has the lowest percentage of population in female. The following graph gives information about volunteer work. The items include male and female. The horizontal axis is year, ranging from 1990 to 2004. According to this graph, in 1990, the value of male is around 26, the same as female. According to this graph, the highest value of male is 45, which is in 2004. According to this graph, the value of male is higher than female, and the highest value of female is 30. In conclusion, there is a gap between male and female on volunteer work. The following graph gives information about consumption of fast food by Australian teenagers. The items include pizza, fish, and chips. You can see from this graph that the value of fish and chips in 1995 is around 50. You can see from this graph that the value of pizza in 1985 is around 30, which is lower. You can see from this graph that the value of hamburgers in 2000 is around 100, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that the value of pizza in 1975 is around 5, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about plastic bottle recycling. The steps include new bottles, refilling, used bottles and plastic processing, and, according to this graph, the first step is newly produced bottles, which are empty. According to this graph, the second step is to fill the empty bottles with beverage. You can see from this graph that the third step is to open the bottles and drink up it, followed by the fourth step is to transport used bottles back to the factory and use them as materials. The final step is the plastic materials turned into new bottles waiting for refilling. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about how tomatoes come to consumers. The steps include a tomato tree, transportation, filtering, packaging. According to this graph, the first step is the tomato tree, which grows many tomatoes on the branches. According to this graph, the second step is to transport tomatoes by a blue truck. You can see from this graph that the third step is to filter bad tomatoes out on a conveyor belt, followed by a crate full of good tomatoes as the fourth step. The final step is to fill the shopping cart with the good tomatoes for consumers. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about Litchfield population. The horizontal axis is the years, ranging from 1901 to 2011. According to this graph, in the year of 1911, the value is around 8,000. And according to this graph, in the year of 1941, the value is around 10,000. The highest value is around 32,500, which is in 2011. On the contrary, the lowest value is 7,000, which is in 1901. In conclusion, if this trend continues, the Litchfield population will keep rising in the future. The following graph gives information about compositions of air. The items include oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases. You can see from this graph that, in oxygen, the value is around 20%. You can see from this graph that, in other gases, the value is around 1%, which is lower. You can see from this graph that, in nitrogen, the value is around 79%, which is the highest. You can also see from this graph that, in oxygen, the color is pink. And other gases include carbon dioxide, argon, and water vapor. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about a floor plan. The items include a main hall, an office, a kitchen, and toilets. You can see from this graph that there is a main hall, which is in the upper area of the plan. You can see from this graph that there are toilets for males and females, which are on the right of the plan. You can see from this graph that there is a toilet for the handicapped, which is in the bottom right corner with a sign of wheelchair. You can see from this graph that there is a kitchen in the bottom left corner and an office in the middle of the plan. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about internet users who accessed via mobile phone. The items include 16 to 24, 55 to 64, and 65 plus. You can see from this graph that, in 45 to 54, the value is around 32%. You can see from this graph that, in 35 to 44, the value is around 50, which is higher. You can see from this graph that, in 16 to 24, the value is around 70%, which is the highest. You can also see from this graph that, in 65 plus, the value is around 8%, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative.